Welcome to Voice of the Nation. Now we are in the month of July and we are going to take a look how the economy is doing at the moment and what the economy is going to be like for the rest of the year for both global economy and Thai economy. And joining us today is Dr. Amontep Jawala, Executive Vice President from CIMB Thai Bank. Welcome Dr. Amontep to our program.
สวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีครับ Dr. Amontep. Thank you very much for your time. Yes, and let me ask you that now we are in July. The first half of 2022 have already passed. How do you view the world economy in the first half of 2022?
Lots of challenges. I would say that we saw the first half of the year, beginning with the Fed hiking their interest rate. Inflation was there in the U.S. and has been there. The EU, has sort of like tension with Russia. Remember the Russian-Ukraine conflicts actually caused energy prices to go up, and that caused global economy to decline in terms of the growth. China faced sort of like partial lockdown, given that the new cases of the COVID-19 rising there. China would have the zero COVID policy. So actually, that would be a way that would cause supply chain disruption or even the demand in China that slowed down, that hurt our exports in the Asean region as well. So we saw sort of like challenges across the world by the first half of the year, but it was not that severe to cause the global recession, but it was sort of like the tension or challenges that we still need to face going forward in the second half of the year.
Okay, so there's a lot of unexpected things that happened for the first half of 2022.
Correct.
And what about economy in Thailand? How did we do for the first half of this year?
Well, remember the first quarter of the year, economy grew sort of like 2.2%. So it was not that bad. It actually higher than our expected growth, given that we still have the new cases of the COVID-19. Omicron was there. So actually we sort of like closed down in some business sectors. People still had low confidence to go out. So actually consumption actually grew just really modestly. But in a hope that global economy was not that bad. I mean, we mentioned that there were challenges given that high inflation and so forth, but our exports drove growth during the first quarter of the year and dragged into the second quarter of the year. So actually, we still have that potential to grow, especially from the second quarter. We opened up our economy faster than expected. So actually, we thought about opening up by July, but they did that by May or even in June. So actually, we saw a number of tourists coming in, actually that drive consumption, investment, and so forth, especially on the service sector. So the Thai economy actually grew in a way that better than our expected, but still low in a way. So the second quarter, we projected roughly 2 to 3% growth. So the first half of the year, the growth is roughly 2 to 3%. Not that good, but not that bad. I would say it's just moderate in a way that we can deal with sort of like opening up of the economy. Exports and tourism are growth engine. Consumption, investment, or domestic demand remain soft, but not that bad in a way.
Okay, and is 2 or 3% growth, is that good if compared to other countries?
We are sort of like the lowest growth in the region. So we are not that pessimistic in our economy, but still we need to be realistic in a way that growth of roughly 2 to 3% is sort of like low in a way. We still need to, because we heavily rely on external factors, for example, exports, tourism. And once we are opening up, we see the demand is still there. We see a number of tourists coming in. So actually that would be a good opportunities for us by the second half of the year. But I would say that the first half of the year is sort of like moderate in a way, kind of low in the region. But we need to speed up by the second half of the year.
Okay, and talking about the challenge that we are facing right now, one of the challenges that affect people directly is inflation. Do you think that inflation in Thailand is as bad as other countries?
Inflation is bad across the world. It's rising across the world. You look at the US, it's over 8%. Thailand, the latest data came out at over 7%. So we are approaching, the peak of inflation by the third quarter of the year. Of course, right now we are in the middle of, high inflation across the world. I would say that Thailand got hit with inflation higher than other countries in the region. Why is that? Because we heavily rely on the imports of oil, energy, fuel, and so forth, fertilizer. So those are factors that drive our inflation in Thailand to hit over 7% year on year. But I would say that demand in Thailand, domestic demand is recovering. So core inflation, that means that inflation of the prices excluding oil and food, keep on increasing as well. So reflection of higher demand in Thailand as well. But going forward by the third quarter of the year, I need to warn you that we could have high inflation over than 7%. It could go to 8, 9. I fear that it could hit 10% by the third quarter of the year. Why is that? Because of the low base last year. So inflation remains our key challenge of this quarter.
Okay, so things are going to get more expensive for the rest of the year. And now looking ahead to the second half of 2022, do you think the global economy will go further to be closer to the level before the pandemic?
Well, surprisingly, the world economy has already surpassed the pre-COVID level. We thought about like the end of the 2019, right? So we got hit with early 2020. So that means that the global economy, especially advanced economy, has been declining in terms of the growth. But we look about V-shaped recovery. So they drop just a few months and then they pick up, straight away because they have a lot of fiscal stimulus. They have a lot of monetary easing, lower the rates, pumping liquidity, and so forth. So the world economy already picked up. But when we look at country by country, especially Thailand, we are not there yet. We are not in the level that surpassed the pre-COVID level. We project that by early next year, the Thailand's economy could surpass the pre-COVID level. Why we are so slow? I would say that because we heavily relied on tourism revenue. So once we're opening up the border, we will get more tourism revenue. Thailand's economy will pick up bit by bit. So that means that we're likely to recover by early next year. But of course, when we look at advanced economies or major economies in the world, they already passed the pre-COVID level. But it doesn't mean that they are not facing the risks. Once they pass the pre-COVID level, they still face the slowing growth. So the story by the second half of this year is just a deceleration. So that means the growth is slowing down. We look at the US. We thought that it could grow like over 3%, but now the Fed, central bank in the US, already projected at 1.7% growth this year and 1.7% growth next year. So that means that we see a decline in terms of the growth. It's still positive, but it's just something that we need to be careful.
Okay, and for Thailand economy, as you mentioned, that we are depending on a lot on tourism and also on export. How are these two sectors doing at the moment?
Doing great. I would say that doing great because look at number of tourists coming in. We raised our projections from roughly 5 million tourists this year to over 7.5 million number of tourists this year. So that means that we are revising up in terms of the projections that would benefit economies in the service sector, hotels, restaurants, department store, all kinds of things that would get benefits from tourists coming in Thailand. So that's the one thing. The second one is exports. Of course, we look at exports, given that the global growth is decelerating, slowing growth. But it doesn't mean that they would not have the demand from goods from Thailand. So I would say that we still have competitiveness in terms of exports of electronics, automobile and parts, processed agricultural products. Those are the factors that would drive growth in Thailand. Of course, we'll see an increase in capacity utilization rate. Factories are working hard to get the products out. So actually, that's a good one that workers would get more paid. They would have more income and they would spend a lot more. So actually, that bit by bit would transfer from external factors like export and tourism coming to domestic demand.
Okay, about tourism, I think before COVID-19 hit Thailand, we have about 30 million tourists per year, and most of them are Chinese. But now, since the Chinese are still under lockdown, where do we get our tourists from, mainly instead of China?
Interestingly, because before COVID, we have almost 40 million tourists coming in, 1/3 or even 1/4 of them from China. Right now, even we have the projection of 7.5 million this year. Across the board, ranging from 5 to 8 million in terms of the different research houses. We don't count Chinese tourists coming in anyway. A very small number in this way, given that China even in not locked down per se, but they restrict traveling abroad. So that means that they would have a very low number of tourists from China anyway this year, or even early next year. We don't expect any tourists from China, given that there are good news in China that they eased in terms of the lockdown period or number of restrictions of traveling. But it doesn't mean that would allow tourists from China going out anyway. But let's say 7.5 million. Who are they? I would say that the number one from India. Surprisingly, we see a lot of tourists from India. India already eased the lockdown. India already allowed tourists to go out. Over 1 billion people are trying to go out of India to travel. And Thailand is one of the best destinations that they would come. They come to Thailand, given that it's not that expensive. They want to come for a long period of time. So actually that's a good one for Thailand. But they're not big spenders in a way. So that means that per capita income is low. So that means that they wanted to go to travel, but it doesn't mean that they will spend a lot more as Europeans. But of course, right now we see a lot more tourists from UK or other countries in Europe coming into Thailand. So they are big spenders in a way. They spend a lot more, but the number is not as high as we compare to number of tourists from China. Apart from that one, we see tourists from ASEAN, like Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam. We see a lot from tourists in this way, that would spend money in Thailand. So going forward, this still just low season in Thailand. Third quarter is not a high season. So let's hope for the fourth quarter of this year, starting from October, we would say that we tend to have over 1 million tourists per month. So actually, I am looking forward to the fourth quarter of this year.
Okay, and may I ask you that personally, do you think that country like China and Japan will ease their lockdown and quarantine soon? Because there are just only a few countries left that are still have a very, very strict regulation about entering or leaving their countries. Do you think that they might ease their restrictions soon?
I would say, this is the trend in the world. Once we have the vaccines, even the number of cases has been increasing. But once we have the vaccines, the COVID-19, the Omicron is not that severe. So we know that we would go for the economic recovery rather than look at the health situation. But of course, it doesn't mean that we don't care about the health, but we look at the capacity in the hospitals. We look at those who are at risk, those who are aging population, and those who have internal disease and so forth. So in that way, we will say that in some countries, they will try to ease the lockdown pretty soon, like Japan or East Asia. So actually, it's a good chance for Thai to travel abroad as well to those countries. But China is another story, because the vaccines used in China is not the new technology, not the mRNA type. So I would say that we wait for the mRNA type of vaccines to be used in China before Chinese government would allow their citizens to go out of the country. So that means that it could be by the early next year, hopefully, that would be allowed for these type of vaccines to be used in China.
Okay, and interestingly, you say that we have a lot of tourists from India and also a lot from ASEAN countries, because I noticed that when I go to department store now, I see a lot of Vietnamese. Okay, so now I would like to ask you about ASEAN, because Thailand is in ASEAN. Do you think that most countries in ASEAN are doing okay in terms of economic recovery after COVID, if compared to other regions?
Well, I would say that we are quite slow to recover, given that we heavily rely on exports. And we got we are quite slow in terms of getting the vaccines as well last year. So we had a lockdown in some countries. Like you look at Vietnam last year. You mentioned about Vietnam tourists. So let's say Vietnam. Vietnam is a bright spot in ASEAN. So we will still look at Vietnam as a top destination for investment, as well for the Thai local companies as well as from foreign companies abroad. But we look at Vietnam. Third quarter of last year, they had a lockdown because they're quite slow in terms of the vaccinations and the new cases jump up. So they had a lockdown during the third quarter of the year. Then they eased the lockdown afterwards. So the factories tend to operate as usual. And early this year, we see the potential growth in Vietnam as well. So I would say that we were slow in the past in terms of the vaccinations, but this year we tend to recover quite fast, given that when we ease the lockdowns, we tend to recover with exports and tourism and a lot more things, but only in few countries that heavily rely on tourism like Thailand. So that means that we tend to be slow in the first half of the year, but we are getting there. We are catching up by the second half of the year. But let's see ASEAN. I would say that given that the global economy is slowing down, you see the fears of the recession in the US, the tension with EU and Russia, given that oil price actually jump up. So, but I would say that ASEAN, we are quite diversified in terms of the countries that we export. We go and export to Japan, China, EU, the US, and we trade among ourselves. So that's a way, in a way that we can insulate, the volatility of the world and trade among us. But it's not. We still need to export a lot more to other countries. So that means that we need to go with the FTA. We cannot just trade with the ASEAN. We need to go with the RCEP. That means that apart from ASEAN, we plus 10 countries. So that's the way that we can attract more foreign direct investment.
Okay, and what are some of the economic policy do you think that Thai government need to prepare in order to boost the export, boost the tourism, or give people confidence about the economic situation for the second half of this year?
We have done a lot with exports and tourism. So actually the government doesn't have to do anything, just ease the problems of the lockdown and so forth, and raise the confidence that foreign tourists can come to Thailand easily without any restrictions. I think the best way for the government to do right now is to boost the confidence and domestic demand. External demands are there, but we need to boost up domestic demand. For example, we need to build up the market for the Thai people. We need to increase the employment for the low-income segment. The inequality is still there. Remember that we talk about external demand as strong, exports and tourism there, but domestic demand, especially for the low-income segment, are not recovering. Farm income picking up, but you think about this one. Income is picking up, but expenditures, we talk about inflation at the beginning, right? Fertilizer, the cost of materials and so forth jump up. So farmers actually got hit in a way with the high inflation. So going forward, I think the policies that need to look at the low income sectors, that they're not recovering as fast as the middle class and upper income. Another one is that tourism. We talk about tourists coming in Thailand, 7 million, 10 million and so forth. But they are traveling just very few provinces, very few cities in Thailand. You talk about Pattaya, you talk about Samui, Phuket, whatever, but they're not going to small cities. So we need to encourage Thai tourists to go out, to promote tourism within the countries. So I would say that we still need to pick up on that one to increase income distribution.
Yes, income inequality is still a big problem in Thailand. And for a lot of people, they had a very difficult time in the past 2 years. Many people lost their jobs, lost their business, and lost their saving. And this year, things started to look better since a lot of countries opened their borders and tourists started to come back. But then there are also problems like inflation. So what advice will you give to people or business owners about the economic situation for the rest of the year?
For Thailand, the main challenge that we have is a high and rising household debt. So that means that income is growing slower than expenditure. We talk about inflation is there, so that means that expenditure has been picking up very fast. Income is growing with the growth, roughly 3 to 4%. We talk about second half of this year, even we see the bright spot that we're recovering with the opening up. The GDP growth in Thailand is going to roughly 4% by the second half of this year. But inflation could hit 10% by the third quarter. So that means that we need to find the best way to manage our balance sheet, household balance sheet. That means that we need to know what to spend, what to save, what to look for opportunities to buy. So the upper middle class or middle class, I would say that if the income is stable, so at least they have potential to grow with their opportunities to find revenue. I would say that it doesn't mean that they need to tighten up the belt. I mean they can look at opportunities to buy, to expand their investment, to cope with the rising growth going forward. But my worry is on the low income segment, especially the farm income. So they need to look at a way to spend. They need to save a lot more to look at the slow recovery in that segment. But it doesn't mean that we need to go back to tighten up. We don't need to lock down and whatever. So that means that going forward, if you have income, if you have money, the market now is cheap for the real estate, for stock market, for a lot more things. So that means that we can diversify our portfolio to look at the best way to spend or invest. It doesn't mean that we need to save everything back. But of course, during the volatility in the next couple of months, I think it's best time to study what is the best tools to invest.
Okay. Can I also ask about the unemployment situation? Is the unemployment situation this year better than last year?
I'm not worried about unemployment rate in Thailand. The number of people who lost their job is very small anyway, compared to other countries. But my worry is on underemployment. What is the difference between underemployment and unemployment? Unemployment means those who don't have job. But the case in Thailand, the labor market is underemployment. That means that people are not working, have opportunities to work long hours. So in a one day they can work just a few hours, and they can be those who are employed, or they don't get high income. For example, those who are like self-employed, they sell things on the street. They don't sell, they don't work all day. They don't have opportunities to work all day, given that people have time to just work like a few hours in the market. So that means that income is low. So the recommendation is that they need to find things to sell that could increase the value of their products, or find a way to increase the effectiveness of their working hours and so forth. Things that sell online or sell on the market as well. So those are the things that we need to catch up with the self-employed segment rather than the formal sector.
Okay, so two things that Thai people need to be aware of is the household debt and inflation. And you say that 10% inflation that we might see by the end of this year. And that sounds very scary.
Yeah, I just need to warn you that given that oil price remain like this, and when we open up the border, with tourism coming in, we see demand pull inflation. So inflation could go up quite fast by the third quarter of this year. I would say that the peak of inflation is just the third quarter year. It could go to 8 to 9. I just want you to go up to 10, if something we don't know happened. But by the end of the year, inflation would likely to go down. So that means that, given that a lot more stories, low base last year, hit on the third quarter, but the fourth quarter of the year, inflation likely to come down, and as well as for the next year. But when we say down, we are not going to see inflation at 2% anyway. So that means that it's coming down, but very slow.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. Amonte, for talking with us today. And we hope for the best for Thai economic recovery for the rest of the year. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you, Kap.
ขอบคุณครับ And that's all for Voice of the Nation today. Thank you for staying with us.